On a pleasant summer night in 2015, the vibrant energy of downtown Chicago was on full display. The streets were alive with the sounds of taxi horns, distant sirens, and the happy chatter from people enjoying a Friday evening at bustling restaurants. However, inside one of the city's towering apartment buildings, an otherwise normal evening was about to descend into a perplexing mystery that would capture Chicago's attention for years to come. A 29-year-old woman resided there alone, in a corner apartment that offered a stunning view of the city lights. By all measures, she had a well-organized life. She held a steady marketing job, enjoyed a supportive group of friends, and had a family that regularly kept in touch. Friends and family described her as an outgoing and self-reliant person who valued her daily routines. Her plan for that particular evening was straightforward. She was to meet two friends for dinner at a nearby restaurant, an arrangement they had confirmed just days before. But she never made it. Initially, her friends thought she was just running late, perhaps delayed by traffic or a last-minute task at work. They tried calling and sending text messages, but there was no response. Their unease grew because it was completely out of character for her to miss an engagement without any notice. By the time the restaurant was closing, they were certain that something was amiss. The two friends decided to walk over to her apartment building, considering the possibility that she might have suddenly felt unwell or had simply forgotten their plans. Upon their arrival in the lobby, the doorman told them that he had not seen her leave the building, nor had she signed out. Inside her apartment, the scene suggested she had only left for a brief moment. The front door had been locked from the outside. Her cell phone was on the nightstand, still connected to its charger. Her purse was resting on the kitchen counter with her wallet and credit cards securely inside. A pair of her favorite shoes was arranged neatly by the entryway. There was no indication that she had packed a bag or had any intention of leaving voluntarily. Later, some neighbors recalled hearing footsteps hurrying down the hallway around midnight. A couple of residents mentioned the sound was rushed and irregular, as if someone might have been carrying a heavy object, but nobody actually saw her depart. The security camera in the hallway had a blind spot right past the elevators, a design flaw that left a critical gap in the sequence of events. The last confirmed sighting of her was much earlier that day, around 6 p.m., when she entered the building's lobby, offered a polite smile to the concierge, and took the elevator up to her floor. After that moment, it was as if she had simply vanished without a trace. When her family was notified, a sense of panic quickly set in. Her mother drove into the city from the suburbs that very night, getting to the building just as the police were completing their initial search. She entered the apartment, desperately hoping to find her daughter there, perhaps sleeping or just unreachable. Instead, she was met with an unbearable quiet. Her daughter's clothes were still hanging in the closet, her makeup was arranged tidily on the bathroom vanity, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered. Every single thing was right where it should be, except for her. The Chicago Police Department promptly began to investigate the situation as a suspicious disappearance. They were well aware of the statistics. Cases of missing adults often go unreported for several days. This situation, however, was clearly different. This was a woman with strong family connections, a stable career, no past instances of running away, and no signs that she was depressed or planning to leave her life behind. Officers started to systematically canvass the building, going door to door on every floor. While many neighbors had nothing new to add, others reported small, unusual occurrences. An elevator door opening late after midnight, quiet, muffled voices in the hallway, and what one person described as a soft dragging sound coming from near the service corridor. None of these individual accounts formed a clear picture, but together they suggested something highly unusual had taken place inside that building on the night she went missing. The news of her disappearance spread rapidly throughout the neighborhood. By the next morning, news crews were stationed outside the high-rise, filming detectives as they came and went. Flyers featuring her photograph began to appear on lampposts, in the windows of local coffee shops, and at train stations all over the downtown area. For her colleagues, friends, and family, the news was a profound shock. One minute she was confirming dinner plans, and the next she was gone. Investigators delved into her digital life. Her very last communication was a brief text message to one of her friends to confirm their dinner plans. Following that message, her digital footprint went cold. There were no further calls, no new emails, and no activity on her social media accounts. Her bank records showed that her debit and credit cards had not been used. The police also checked her ride-sharing and public transit history, but there was no evidence that she had traveled anywhere. It was as though the building itself had absorbed her. The apartment offered no signs of a break-in, no damaged locks, and no evidence of a physical struggle, yet the circumstances were deeply unsettling. The fact that the door was locked from the outside, combined with her abandoned phone and purse and missing keys, strongly indicated to investigators that someone else had been in control. This person either had access to her apartment or knew how to bypass the building's security measures. As the hours stretched into days, the story captivated the entire city. A young woman had disappeared from her own home in a secure downtown Chicago building, equipped with cameras, locks, and occupied by hundreds of residents. Her family made tearful appeals on television, pleading for anyone with any information to step forward. Volunteers formed search parties that combed through parks, alleyways, and the city's riverwalks. Despite their efforts, not a single trace of her was found, and no clues emerged to suggest where she could be. With each question that went unanswered, a sense of fear grew. If she could vanish so completely from a supposedly safe apartment in the middle of the city, could it happen to someone else? The case was no longer just about a single missing person. It was about an entire city forced to confront how easily someone could disappear into silence from a place that was meant to be secure. And that silence was just the beginning. Within the initial 24 hours, the investigators were acutely aware that time was their greatest enemy. The success of missing person cases was often determined in these early moments, and a significant amount of valuable time had already passed. When a larger police force arrived the morning after she had missed a dinner engagement, her ordinary downtown apartment building was transformed into the epicenter of a baffling mystery that cried out for answers. The officers quickly set up a makeshift command center in the lobby, the air filled with the static of their radios as detectives started to methodically move from one floor to another. They knocked on every door, questioning any resident who might have been awake during the late hours of the night. This first canvassing of the building, however, only deepened the confusion. Many of the residents reported that they had neither seen nor heard anything out of the ordinary. Others seemed uncertain, their memories clouded by the typical background noises of a bustling city high-rise. One neighbor recalled hearing the soft thud of a door closing around midnight. Another remembered the sound of heavy footsteps in the stairwell, but nobody could confirm if these sounds were connected to her. The building's overnight security guard acknowledged that he hadn't observed anything unusual, mentioning that his duties that night had kept him away from the residential floors. The one thing the police desperately needed, a clear statement from an eyewitness, was completely absent. Their focus soon shifted to the building's surveillance cameras. Chicago is a city known for its extensive video monitoring, and this particular building was no different. Detectives began reviewing footage from the lobby, the parking garage, and every exterior entrance. After watching hours of video, they only confirmed what they already suspected. She had entered the building shortly after 6 p.m., looking composed while holding her work bag and keys. She exchanged a polite greeting with the doorman before walking toward the elevator. Following that moment, the video recordings showed nothing more. She was never captured on camera leaving the premises. The cameras covering the main entrance, the garage, and even the side alley exit had failed to record her departure. For a young woman living by herself in a modern structure equipped with technology intended to prevent such an event, This void in the footage was deeply unsettling. The elevator logs uncovered an even stranger detail. At 12:07 in the morning, the service elevator had been used to travel from her floor down to the basement garage. Just under 10 minutes later, the same elevator returned to her floor, completely empty. A review of the maintenance schedules confirmed that no authorized staff members were on duty at that hour. Whether it was her or someone else, the building's security system had logged the movement but provided no image of the person who had operated the elevator. This electronic footprint was a tantalizing piece of evidence, yet it ultimately led nowhere. While the investigators grappled with the missing pieces of the timeline, her family and friends held on to the hope that she might still be found somewhere in the vicinity. Volunteers rapidly came together, printing and distributing hundreds of flyers that featured her smiling, professional, and easily identifiable photograph. They covered the surrounding neighborhood, affixing the flyers to lamp posts, bus shelters, and the glass exteriors of train stations. Her friends went from business to business along the street, leaving stacks of flyers on counters and in employee break rooms. Every person who walked by was seen as a potential witness, and every stranger was someone who might have noticed her on the evening she went missing. The search expanded outward from her building. Groups of volunteers meticulously combed through alleys and side streets. Some walked the entire stretch of the Chicago Riverwalk, checking inside stairwells and looking under bridges. Others inspected parking garages, dumpsters, and even construction sites that were deserted for the night. They called out her name into the darkness, their voices mixing with the sounds of city traffic and the river flowing nearby. Despite the desperate urgency and the large number of people searching the area, no trace of her was found. Detectives pursued every single lead, regardless of how weak it seemed. A tip about a woman who matched her description getting on a bus was investigated and ultimately disproven. Rumors that she had been seen at a local bar were dispelled when video footage showed otherwise. Anonymous callers insisted she had been spotted heading toward the train station, but ticketing systems showed no purchases under her name and no video evidence of her entering. Every potential clue fell apart upon closer examination, forcing investigators to confront the disturbing possibility that she had vanished entirely from within the confines of her own home. Her mother, who had hurried to the city on the night she disappeared, spent the following days positioned near the police command post. She vowed not to leave until she had answers, speaking with any detective who would spare a moment and reminding them of the person her daughter was. Family and friends took turns supporting her, bringing coffee, folding more flyers, and joining the search parties. They operated on the belief that if they could only move quickly enough and make enough noise, she could still be brought back safely. However, as the hours turned into days, this hope began to weaken. The story was picked up by national news networks, and her face was shown on screens all over the country. This widespread coverage generated more tips, but none of them proved to be credible. The building itself turned into a media spectacle. News vans were parked outside day and night, with reporters competing to get interviews with the residents. The detectives had to work under the constant pressure of flashing cameras and intense public interest, all while knowing that the trail was rapidly growing cold. In private, the investigators confessed their deep frustration. They were dealing with an apartment that was sealed and undisturbed, with no indication of a break-in, yet the woman who lived there was gone. They had camera footage of her coming in, but not of her going out. They had an elevator log indicating a late-night trip, but no witness to identify who was inside. It was a riddle where the key components were missing, and every lead that went nowhere further eroded their confidence. The initial phase of the search concluded exactly where it had started, with the building itself. Despite the citywide effort and all the volunteers searching the streets and riverbanks, the investigation continually circled back to the same locked apartment, the same unmonitored hallway, and the same unresolved issue. How could a person disappear so thoroughly from a place that was full of people? As the investigation continued, that question would only take on a more sinister tone. After the initial searches yielded nothing, detectives shifted their focus to the people within the missing woman's inner circle. When a person disappears from a securely locked apartment without any obvious clues, the most sensible approach is to investigate those who knew her most intimately. The investigators began to carefully examine her personal relationships, one by one, hoping to find an inconsistency that could explain how she vanished. The first person to be closely examined was her ex-boyfriend. Their romance had ended half a year ago, and friends mentioned that its final weeks had been particularly stormy. He was known for being jealous, frequently making excessive calls, showing up without warning, and even sending aggressive messages if she took too long to reply. To the detectives, he was the most logical starting point for their investigation. They brought him in for interrogation and focused on his activities on the night she went missing. They wanted to know his location after midnight and if anyone could confirm his story. He maintained that he was at home sleeping, a claim that his phone records seemed to support. GPS data indicated his phone was in a suburban area nearly 20 miles away and remained in one place for most of the night. This information lessened the suspicion against him, but did not remove it altogether. Investigators were well aware that digital evidence could be faked, and jealousy has often been the reason ordinary individuals commit extraordinary crimes. Next, their attention turned to the neighbor. Other people in the building had often gossiped about him, calling him unusually nosy. He lived only 2 apartments away and was a man in his 40s who seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of everyone's daily routines. Friends of the missing woman remembered her feeling uneasy around him, saying he would linger in the hallways for too long and always seemed to be around when she was leaving or arriving. Detectives discovered his alibi was not very strong. He stated he had been at home working late and sending emails until the early morning, but the timestamps on his messages had unexplained gaps. His anxious behavior during questioning also raised red flags. He struggled to recall details, gave conflicting statements, and then tried to correct himself. Although none of this was solid proof, it created a suspicious image that made the detectives uncomfortable. Even the woman's employer was not exempt from the investigation. At the marketing agency where she worked, her coworkers spoke of growing friction in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She had recently argued with a manager about project deadlines, and there were whispers that she was thinking about quitting her job. The detectives considered whether pressure from her job might have caused her to leave on her own, or if a conflict at work had taken a more sinister turn. The manager she had argued with denied there was any major problem and described her as a cherished member of the team, but the investigators sensed he was being defensive. However, there was no evidence connecting him to the evening she went missing. Every interview seemed to add another layer to an already complex puzzle. Each person of interest appeared to be a credible suspect for different reasons. A jealous ex-boyfriend with a history of being controlling, a neighbor who paid far too much attention, and a workplace filled with unspoken tensions. Yet, as the detectives investigated further, every potential lead came to a dead end. There was a complete lack of evidence. No fingerprints, no reliable eyewitnesses, and no digital footprints that led anywhere beyond her apartment. Her family could only watch in distress as suspicion cast a shadow over her friends and acquaintances. People who had previously supported one another became wary, each wondering if someone in their group knew more than they were revealing. Her mother, who attended every police update, found it hard to believe that anyone close to her daughter could be responsible for harming her. She pleaded with the detectives to examine every detail and not let anyone escape their notice. At the same time, she dreaded the possibility of hearing a familiar name linked to such a violent act. The media coverage only added to the chaos. News reporters focused on the details of her previous relationship, portraying her ex-boyfriend as an unstable individual. Other journalists highlighted the stories about her neighbor, broadcasting interviews with tenants who called him odd and obsessive. The public became fixated on these theories, acting as if suspicion alone could lead to the truth. For the detectives, this media attention was both a help and a hindrance. It kept the case in the public eye, but it also complicated their work by overwhelming solid facts with rumors and guesswork. Behind closed doors, the pressure on the investigators was immense. They were aware that in cases like this, the person responsible is often someone the victim knew well. However, they also knew that moving forward with a weak case based only on suspicion would cause it to fail in court. They needed something more than just character assessments and hunches. They needed concrete proof that could show where she was taken and identify the person who took her. The days turned into weeks, and with each one that passed, the level of frustration grew. The ex-boyfriend became increasingly angry with the repeated interviews and threatened to file a lawsuit for harassment. The neighbor continued to be vague, giving just enough information to keep his story intact. The employer was eventually cleared as a suspect when his coworkers confirmed he was out of state on the night she disappeared. The detectives kept circling back to these individuals, unable to identify the one who held the key to breaking the case open. For the family, the emotional burden was almost too much to bear. Every ringing phone carried the hope of a breakthrough, but these calls usually ended in more disappointment. They were consistently told that the investigation was moving forward and that the list of suspects was getting shorter. But to them, progress without any real evidence felt like a cruel joke. Each new suspect gave them a glimmer of hope, and each time one was cleared, they felt broken all over again. By the time summer was ending, the investigators had questioned everyone close to her, created detailed timelines, and checked every alibi they could find. Despite all their efforts, they were no closer to finding an answer. The case, which had once seemed so pressing and solvable, was now becoming a grim mystery where everyone was a potential suspect, yet no one could be proven guilty. It was at this point, just when the investigation seemed to have completely stalled, that a new forensic analysis of her apartment would uncover questions far more disturbing than any alibi could resolve. As the weeks went by, the pressing need to solve the case ran into a series of misleading tips that only made the situation more frustrating. The first false lead originated at a bus station on the south side of the city. A clerk there was convinced he had witnessed a woman who matched her description getting on a late-night Greyhound bus headed to Indianapolis. Investigators quickly worked to check ticket sales, security videos, and passenger lists. However, the woman in the blurry footage was not her. She had a similar body type and hairstyle, but her face was different. This was just the first of many reported sightings that would spark a moment of hope before quickly falling apart. Another tip came from a caller who reported a taxi driver. The person claimed they had heard the driver boasting about giving a young woman a ride from the Loop to a western suburb on the same night she went missing. The information was specific enough to seem credible. Detectives managed to find the driver, but he denied the story completely. His trip logs for that evening showed no pickups from her apartment building, and his phone's GPS data confirmed that his route did not align with the caller's claim. Just like numerous other tips that would surface, it turned out to be a mere rumor presented as a credible fact. Then, the most peculiar theory emerged from whispers suggesting she had run away to join a secret cult. A colleague came forward with information that initially seemed alarming. He revealed that in the weeks before her disappearance, she had been researching unconventional religious groups online and reading about organizations that operated in the shadows. The coworker hinted that she might have been persuaded to leave her life behind on her own. Investigators pursued this lead by examining her internet search history, looking into the articles she read, and even reaching out to known secretive groups in the area. They discovered no evidence connecting her to any cult or indicating she had any plans to abandon her life. What appeared to be a significant clue turned out to be a simple coincidence, reflecting only her curious nature and not her ultimate destiny. For each lead that seemed promising, there were many more that led nowhere. People called in with sightings from various places like train stations, restaurants, and shopping centers. Every single report brought a flicker of optimism, but each one ultimately ended in disappointment. The detectives started to acknowledge something that no one wanted to admit. They were stuck, repeatedly going over the same empty hallway in her building and staring at the same locked apartment door with no new information to guide them. The media, which had initially been a powerful voice for the family's desperate calls for assistance, grew critical. Newspaper headlines began to accuse the investigators of botching the case, claiming they had wasted crucial time at the beginning and failed to properly secure the building. Commentators on television and radio openly speculated about the possibility of corruption, a cover-up, or sheer incompetence. Every press conference turned into a defensive exercise, with detectives repeating the same rehearsed statements. The investigation is ongoing. We are pursuing all leads, and we ask for your patience. However, patience was wearing thin. Within the family, the emotional pressure became almost too much to handle. Her mother held firm to her conviction that a crime had been committed. She focused on the strange details that didn't add up, the door being locked, the purse left untouched, and the keys being gone. For her, these were clear indications that someone else was involved and had taken her daughter by force. In contrast, other family members started to consider the possibility that she had chosen to leave. They brought up her stress at work, small hints of wanting a change, and her online searches about starting a new life. They believed it was plausible that she had planned her own disappearance to escape the pressures she was facing. These differing views led to private arguments. During vigils, one group would pray for her to be returned safely, while the other would quietly express doubts about whether she even wanted to be found. What had started as a unified family effort soon fractured into suspicion and bitterness, with each theory creating a deeper divide. Friends, caught in the middle of the family's conflict, found themselves drawn into the same debate, trying to make sense of the woman they knew and the profound silence she had left behind. Detectives felt the mounting pressure as well. Every new tip carried the burden of public hope, and every failure further damaged the community's trust in them. In private conversations, officers confessed that the investigation felt like being trapped in quicksand. Any attempt to move forward only caused them to sink further into uncertainty. They had secured the building, reviewed all the records, and documented countless interviews, yet nothing had advanced the case beyond the night she vanished. The case was no longer just about finding evidence. It had become about managing public perception, which was becoming increasingly negative. By the time 3 months had passed, the case file had expanded to hundreds of pages, but the narrative it contained was empty. It was a collection of leads that had been thoroughly investigated and proven false, suspects who had been questioned and cleared, and sightings that were all mistakes. All that was left was a void. A young woman had disappeared without a trace, and the investigation was collapsing under the weight of its own failures. For her mother, every false lead was another painful blow, another day spent waiting for a phone call that never delivered any real answers. She started speaking to the media less frequently, her voice strained and her eyes showing the toll of sleepless nights. Despite her exhaustion, she refused to give up. She organized new search parties, had more flyers printed, and continuously pleaded with detectives to continue their efforts. In her mind, surrendering was not an option. However, for others in her circle, maintaining hope became more difficult. Friends gradually stopped participating in the search groups, worn out by the endless cycle of promising tips that led to dead ends. Some eventually stopped coming to vigils, finding it too painful to confront the silence that grew longer with each passing day. The city also began to forget. Her story was replaced by new headlines, and the crowds that once gathered outside her building dwindled. What had been a major case, capturing the city's attention, started to fade into the constant stream of news in Chicago. And yet, behind the locked door of her apartment, the same questions lingered. Who had been in that hallway at midnight? Why hadn't the security cameras recorded her departure? And how could a person disappear so completely from a building full of people? It was these persistent, unanswered questions that kept the detectives up at night, long after all the leads had been exhausted. Months after she disappeared, when the flow of tips had stopped and the investigation seemed to be at a complete standstill, detectives decided to revisit the one place that might still hold clues: her apartment. The unit had been sealed off since the investigation began, with everything inside left exactly as she had left it. At first, it looked like a snapshot of a young woman's life, paused in the middle of a moment. Her shoes were neatly arranged by the door, a partially written grocery list was pinned to the refrigerator, and her phone charger was still plugged into the wall. However, for the crime scene technicians, the apartment was not a memorial but a puzzle that needed to be examined with fresh eyes. They returned with more advanced equipment, more time, and a renewed focus on looking past the obvious. Using ultraviolet light, they carefully scanned the bedroom floor. That's when they discovered it: faint streaks on the carpet that were almost impossible to see with the naked eye. The marks were irregular and angled, suggesting that something, or someone, had been dragged across the floor. The stains were too old to get a conclusive chemical analysis, but their pattern alone was enough to cause serious concern. The investigators had overlooked this during their initial search, distracted by the intense media pressure and the urgency to find her alive. Now, these marks hinted at a quiet struggle that had taken place on that very floor. Near the bedroom window, they made another discovery. A partial palm print was smudged on the window frame, left with enough force to create a residue invisible in normal light. It was not a match for her prints or those of her family members. Detectives ran the print through their databases, hoping for a match that would break the case open, but it returned no results. Whoever had been in that room on that night had left behind only a faint trace of their presence, a partial print that suggested an intruder but did not reveal a name. The bathroom provided its own set of clues. Technicians observed that the grout between the tiles was unevenly colored. A chemical analysis confirmed that traces of bleach had been absorbed deep into the material. While bleach is a common household cleaner, in this context, it raised alarming questions. Why would someone have needed to scrub that area so thoroughly right around the time she disappeared? The detectives suspected this was not about routine cleaning. It was likely an effort to destroy evidence. These new discoveries did not bring a sense of relief. Instead, they brought a feeling of dread. For the first time, the apartment felt less like a place from which she had simply vanished and more like the location of a violent act. However, without a body and without DNA evidence strong enough to connect anyone to the stains or the bleach, the investigators could not move forward with criminal charges. Prosecutors cautioned the detectives to be careful, reminding them that suspicions were not the same as hard evidence. Faint traces and smudges were not enough to build a case that could be presented in a court of law. Despite the challenges, the investigators continued their work. They re-interviewed the neighbors, this time asking more specific questions based on their new findings. They asked if anyone had smelled unusual cleaning chemicals coming from her apartment, or if they had seen maintenance workers near her unit before or after she went missing. A few neighbors vaguely remembered smelling something sharp and chemical-like in the hallway late at night. Others recalled hearing water running for extended periods in her bathroom. But these memories were months old and unreliable, and none of the information was solid enough to be considered more than speculation. The family's reaction to this new evidence was heartbreaking. For her mother, the marks on the carpet and the bleach in the bathroom confirmed her worst fears. Her daughter had been harmed inside her own apartment. The theory that she had disappeared voluntarily, once whispered among relatives, now seemed entirely impossible. This was not the story of a woman who had simply walked away. It was the story of someone who had been forcibly taken. Yet any relief the family felt at having their suspicions confirmed was immediately overshadowed by the painful reality that these findings did not lead to any concrete answers. They had some information, but it was not the kind that could bring them peace. The media reported on these new details with a mix of fascination and horror. News anchors described the unsettling smudges and bleach traces as if they were narrating a crime show. This coverage renewed public interest in the case, but it also led to criticism. Commentators began to question why it had taken the police months to uncover these clues. They wondered if the investigators had missed their opportunity in the first crucial days of the investigation, and if important evidence had been lost due to delays and oversights. For the police department, it was another hit to their reputation, casting yet another shadow over an already struggling investigation. Behind the scenes, the detectives admitted they felt stuck. The evidence strongly suggested that something violent and deliberate had occurred inside that apartment, but without a body, the story was incomplete. In missing person cases, prosecutors require certainty, not just theories. Without physical remains or a confirmed cause of death, every piece of circumstantial evidence could be easily challenged in court. Pushing forward with charges would be a huge risk. If the case collapsed, it would be closed for good. As the months continued to pass, this fear became more intense. The case files grew thicker with reports, photographs, and chemical analyses, but none of it offered a definitive conclusion. The palm print remained unidentified. The streaks on the carpet could not be conclusively explained. The bleach traces pointed to someone's actions but didn't identify who that person was. Each clue seemed to hang just out of reach, like pieces of a puzzle they couldn't quite assemble. For the family, this created a new kind of agony. It was no longer just about their daughter's absence. It was about the haunting presence of what might have happened in her home. The evidence served as a constant reminder that she had likely suffered there, and that someone else had been in those rooms. They desperately wanted justice and a name, but instead, they were repeatedly told that the case was ongoing, words that increasingly sounded like unsolved. In the end, the forensic discoveries shifted the direction of the investigation but failed to resolve it. The detectives now knew more than they had before, yet they were powerless to take the next step. The apartment had revealed some of its secrets, but only enough to confirm the worst fears without providing the proof needed to act on them. As the weight of the evidence met the wall of uncertainty, the case began to balance precariously between possibility and silence, in danger of being permanently relegated to the pile of unsolved files that linger in every major city. After the first year had gone by, the case gradually disappeared from the front pages of the newspapers. What had once been the city's most pressing story started to blend into the background noise of other crimes and tragedies. The anniversary of her disappearance was observed with candlelight vigils held outside her apartment building. Dozens of people gathered, holding her photograph and speaking in hushed tones as they prayed, wept, and shared memories. Reporters still attended, their cameras capturing the soft glow of the candles against the modern glass and steel of the building. However, the nature of the coverage had changed. It was no longer about an active search. It was about a family that refused to give up hope. Inside the police department, the case file continued to grow, but any real progress had stalled. Detectives were rotated out of the case, reassigned to different departments, or retired. Each new investigator who took over the file faced the daunting task of reviewing the same massive collection of old reports, cold leads, and inconclusive findings. Many privately confessed that they believed the truth was likely lost forever. The building had been thoroughly searched, the city had been combed, and all tips had been followed to their dead ends. Without a body or a major breakthrough, all they had were shadows and suspicions. For her mother, the silence was intolerable. She was determined not to let the case be quietly filed away. Month after month, she wrote letters to the police department, begging for any updates, pushing for more action, and reminding them of the person her daughter was. Occasionally, her letters were met with polite, standard replies, assuring her that the investigation remained open. More frequently, they received no response at all, simply added to the ever-growing stack of paperwork in the case file. But she never stopped writing. For her, it was the only way she could fight back against the silence that threatened to erase her daughter's memory completely. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, her family would gather in front of the apartment building. Friends and even strangers would join them, bringing flowers and candles and tapping notes to the doors. Some brought pictures, while others shared poems or letters they had written to her but could never send. For a few hours each year, the building would be transformed into a memorial, its lobby filled with the memory of the woman who had once called it home. But after the candles had melted away and the crowd had gone home, the silence would inevitably return. As time wore on, the case began to take on a new life, not in official police reports but in public rumor. People started to whisper stories about the building itself. Some claimed it was cursed, a place where strange things had happened even before her disappearance. Others were convinced she had been taken by someone who knew the building's layout intimately, someone who was aware of the security cameras' blind spots, the hidden service hallways, and the back exits that residents rarely used. Tenants who moved in after she vanished sometimes admitted to feeling a sense of unease, hearing strange sounds in the hallway, or feeling like they were being watched. They felt the weight of knowing a woman had disappeared from the very floor where they now lived. The building became the subject of a local urban legend. Tour guides conducting late-night walking tour of downtown would sometimes pause and point to it, lowering their voices to tell visitors the story of the woman who walked in but never walked out. The building's residents disliked the attention, but they couldn't escape the shadow that the case cast over their home. For some, the constant reminder became too much to bear, and they eventually moved away, unwilling to live in a place where a mystery lingered like a permanent stain. Her friends grew older and moved into new phases of their lives, getting married, having children, and building careers. But every happy milestone was tinged with the sadness of her absence, the woman who should have been there to celebrate with them. They confessed privately that they found it difficult to talk about her anymore, not because they had forgotten her, but because the memories brought too much pain. They kept her alive in photographs stored away in drawers, in memories that would surface unexpectedly, and in the quiet sense of guilt they felt for moving on with their lives while hers remained frozen in time. Her mother, however, never moved on. She became a prominent figure in the city's advocacy circles for missing persons. She spoke at events, shared her daughter's story, and lobbied for reforms that might prevent other families from enduring the same kind of suffering. She kept her daughter's apartment key on a chain that she wore around her neck, a constant reminder that one day that door might open again, even though she no longer believed in miracles. What she sought now was the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Over the years, small details about the case would occasionally resurface. There were renewed rumors about a suspicious neighbor, whispers about the building's maintenance staff, and speculation about hidden evidence. Each time, the family's hopes would briefly rise, only to be crushed again when no new proof came to light. This cycle of hope and disappointment became its own form of torture, as relentless and unforgiving as the silence itself. By the fifth year, the case was officially designated as cold. The file was moved to long-term storage, still available for review but no longer a priority on any active detective's desk. The mother marked this occasion with another letter. This time, it was addressed not just to the police department but to the entire city. In it, she wrote that her daughter's story was not a cold case, not to her, and not to anyone who loved her. She pleaded with the public to never forget. And yet, slowly but surely, the city did begin to forget. New tragedies dominated the headlines. The apartment building continued to stand, its windows reflecting the city skyline, its lobby now filled with new tenants who knew very little about the woman who had vanished from within its walls. For those who had been directly affected by it, however, the memory remained. Whenever they passed the building, they felt the heaviness of the unanswered questions. When they walked its hallways, they wondered if the answers were hidden somewhere just beyond their reach. The silence that spanned the years was not empty. It was heavy, haunted, and filled with rumors and regrets. In that silence, the case evolved from a simple crime into a story that was woven into the very fabric of the city, a mystery that refused to be forgotten, waiting for the day when someone, somewhere, might finally bring the truth to light. After a decade had passed, the case was brought back into the spotlight. In that time, it had faded into obscurity, becoming just another name on the long list of Chicago's unsolved mysteries. The case file was tucked away in a cold case storage facility, its evidence sealed in boxes and its written notes turning yellow with age. For the family, this long silence had become a painful part of their lives, though it never got any easier to endure. Each passing anniversary brought the same haunting questions and the same unanswered pleas for information. Most people had lost hope that the truth would ever be revealed. However, a decade brings about significant changes, especially in technology. In 2025, a newly established cold case unit chose to re-examine the file. They approached the case with modern tools that were not available in 2015, such as advanced imaging systems, improved forensic software, and access to vast databases that had grown immensely over the last 10 years. Their mission was straightforward: to re-examine old evidence with a fresh perspective. One of the initial pieces of evidence they looked at was the partial palm print that had been smudged on the bedroom window frame. At the time of the original investigation, the print was too distorted to be of any use. The technology available then could not generate a dependable match. But now, sophisticated digital enhancement tools were capable of reconstructing incomplete prints with much higher accuracy. The investigators scanned the print, processed it through the new system, and awaited the results. The outcome was not uncertain or a mere possibility. It was a definite hit. The print was a match for a man who had previously been employed as a maintenance worker in the same building where she had disappeared. His name had only briefly appeared during the initial investigation, lost among many interviews with staff members that yielded no leads. During his interview, he had provided only general information about his daily tasks, which included cleaning, making small repairs, and handling tenant requests. There was nothing about him that seemed unusual or directly connected him to her disappearance. However, the system uncovered what the human eye had missed. The smeared print on the window belonged to him. Detectives immediately began to piece together his history. Records indicated that he had suddenly quit his job just a few weeks after she went missing. He had informed his supervisors that he was relocating to another state for family matters, but did not leave a forwarding address. Within a month, he had vanished from the city's employment records completely. For almost 10 years, his name existed in various databases but never triggered any alerts. Now, it stood out as a significant lead. This new information propelled the investigation forward with renewed energy. Detectives located and spoke with his former colleagues from the building's staff. Several of them recalled him as being peculiar, a man who would occasionally work late when no one else was around, and who appeared to be aware of which apartments were vacant and which tenants were single women. One former staff member confessed that she had once lodged a complaint against him for making inappropriate remarks, but no action was taken at the time. Others remembered his short temper, noting how he would become irritated when questioned by tenants and how he would quickly grow impatient with his supervisors. The family was informed of this significant development during a meeting at the police department. After 10 years of waiting without answers, they found themselves facing a new group of younger detectives who were not part of the original 2015 investigation, but who approached the case with a quiet sense of purpose. They laid out the details of the palm print match, his sudden resignation, and the cloud of suspicion that intensified with each newly discovered fact. For her mother, the news was both a source of comfort and a fresh source of pain. It was a relief because, after so many years, a specific person could finally be linked to her daughter's disappearance. It was a wound because it confirmed her deepest fear. Her daughter had not simply walked away or decided to leave on her own. She had been taken. News of this breakthrough traveled fast. First, local media outlets and then national news networks brought the story back to public attention, with headlines announcing a major advance in the downtown disappearance case. Old television footage of prayer vigils and interviews was broadcast again, now presented alongside the new information about a potential suspect's name. The public, which had largely forgotten the case, was once again reminded of the woman who had entered her apartment building one day and was never seen again. For the investigators, the palm print match was not an end but a new beginning. They were aware that they needed more than just a partial print to build a solid case. They required supporting evidence, a clear trail that would be convincing in a court of law, evidence that would connect him not only to the building, but to the crime itself. They reviewed his work logs, which showed he had signed in late on the evening she disappeared. They meticulously went through old maintenance records, finding that he had been assigned duties in areas near her floor. Each new piece of information added another layer of suspicion, yet they still lacked definitive proof. The city was filled with talk and speculation. Former tenants of the building were interviewed once more and asked if they remembered him. Some recounted feeling a sense of unease around him, sharing stories of seeing him in hallways where he had no business being or hearing the sound of his keys as he moved through service corridors late at night. For years, these had just been minor anecdotes, odd occurrences that were easily dismissed. Now, they were viewed in a much more serious light. The family once again found themselves at the heart of public attention, their private sorrow exposed for the media. They spoke with care, expressing their gratitude for the renewed focus on the case while also conveying their frustration that it had taken a decade for any part of the truth to emerge. The mother's voice trembled as she addressed reporters, saying, "We always knew someone did this. Now, we finally have a name." But a name could not bring her daughter back. For the detectives, the investigation grew more intense. They journeyed to other states, following the trail of the maintenance worker who had vanished years earlier. They sorted through public records, tracked down his previous addresses, and spoke with people who had known him after he left Chicago. Every conversation helped to create a portrait of a man who had started a new life, living a quiet existence and never mentioning the years he had spent working in that building. The reopening of the case brought both clarity and uncertainty. It became clear that she had not disappeared of her own accord but had been a victim of a crime in her own home. However, uncertainty remained because there was still no body, no clear timeline of events, no weapon, and no confession. But for the first time in a decade, the silence was broken. And in that break, the city began to understand that the story was far from over. It was only just beginning to uncover the identity of the man who had been present in those halls on the night she disappeared. Once the partial palm print pointed detectives to the former maintenance worker, the entire investigation shifted to focus on him. For the first time in a decade, they had a name, a face, and the start of a narrative that could explain the long silence. What they discovered next made the case even darker than anyone had imagined. As investigators delved into his past, they found a disturbing pattern that had been previously ignored. Employment records revealed numerous complaints filed by female tenants during his time at the building. Some had accused him of making them uncomfortable with inappropriate comments when he entered their apartments for repairs. Others remembered him loitering in the hallways for extended periods, showing up unannounced, or using his master key to enter apartments claiming it was for routine checks. The building's management had mostly dismissed these complaints as simple misunderstandings or had quietly filed them away to prevent any trouble. However, looking back now, the pattern was unmistakable. He had been observing tenants, pushing boundaries, and learning the routines of women who lived by themselves. His work logs provided more solid evidence. On the night she went missing, He had checked out cleaning supplies and recorded late-night entries for several apartments, including hers. Although maintenance workers often had unconventional schedules, the timing of his activities was too closely aligned with her last known whereabouts. When detectives re-interviewed his former colleagues, several of them recalled seeing him in the hallway that evening with a cart of cleaning materials. One remembered the detail clearly because it was strange for him to be working so late without another staff member present. These memories, which had faded over time, now became crucial details that had been missed a decade ago. The more detectives investigated, the more unusual his life appeared. After his sudden departure from Chicago, he had moved to a different state and started working under a new name. Public records indicated that he lived in small, rented apartments, held various odd jobs, and mostly kept to himself. His neighbors described him as a loner who was sometimes unfriendly but never seemed dangerous. To an outsider, he appeared to be just another person trying to start over. However, investigators believed he was in hiding, intentionally staying unnoticed because of what he had done. The investigation reached a critical point when detectives were granted a search warrant for a storage unit he had rented under his assumed name. Inside, they discovered evidence that prosecutors would later call deeply disturbing. Amidst boxes filled with old tools and personal items, they found artifacts from his time in Chicago. There were old key cards from the building, several of which were still active, held together by rubber bands. They also found notebooks filled with handwritten notes detailing maintenance schedules, tenants' names, and strange observations about when particular residents were at home or away. Some of these notes were from the year she disappeared, which raised the frightening possibility that he had been systematically documenting the women in the building and tracking their movements. For the investigators, this discovery transformed their suspicions into something much more sinister. This was no longer seen as a random crime of opportunity. It pointed to careful planning, obsession, and a desire for control. He was not just a man working late. He was a man who had been studying the people around him, using his access and authority to move through the building undetected. The family was informed of these findings, and the news was devastating. Her mother, who had been seeking answers for 10 years, was finally confronted with the horrific details she had always dreaded. The key cards, the notes, and the history of complaints all confirmed that her daughter had been specifically targeted. She broke down in tears during the meeting, telling the detectives that she had always suspected someone in the building was responsible, but had never imagined the level of obsession that drove the act. The public also responded with shock. News reports detailed the findings with a strong focus on the institutional failures that had allowed him to go unnoticed. Questions were raised about why the tenant's complaints had not been investigated more seriously, and why his late-night work logs had not attracted more attention at the time. Each new piece of information not only pointed to his guilt, but also highlighted the systemic oversights that had allowed him to get away with his actions. Detectives now felt they were closing in on the truth, but they were met with a grim fact. The man was no longer alive. He had passed away from an illness several years prior, leaving behind no confession and no possibility of facing a trial or the family of the woman he had taken. All that remained was the evidence: the palm print, the work logs, the contents of the storage unit, and the unsettling notes, which together formed a case that prosecutors were certain would have resulted in charges if he were still living. For the family, these revelations brought both relief and torment. It was a relief to know that their daughter had not simply vanished without a trace, and that her story now had a perpetrator and a motive behind it. But it was tormenting because there would never be any real justice. The man who held the answers was gone, having taken his secrets to the grave without ever being held accountable. The case was no longer a mystery about what had happened. It had transformed into something more difficult to bear. A story with a known truth but no accountability. A resolution that explained everything but offered no real closure. Nearly 10 years after she disappeared, just as the investigation had identified the man believed to be responsible. A final piece of evidence emerged by a stroke of fate. It was not discovered in a police laboratory or an evidence room but on the banks of the Chicago River, where a new property development was in progress. Construction workers were excavating the ground to prepare the foundations for a new high-rise building when a backhoe hit an object that was wrapped tightly in multiple layers of weathered plastic. At first, the bundle appeared to be nothing more than discarded trash. But as the workers cut it open, the truth was revealed. Human bones were intertwined with remnants of clothing that had been preserved by time and concealment. The police were called to the scene immediately, and the area was secured within hours. Forensic experts arrived at the riverfront and began the careful process of excavating the remains. It did not take long for their suspicions to be confirmed. DNA analysis verified what many in the city had long suspected. The remains were those of the young woman who had disappeared from her downtown apartment in 2015. This discovery brought an end to a decade of uncertainty, but it also introduced darker questions about how close the truth had been all along. The body had been encased in industrial-grade plastic sheeting, the type commonly used for construction or maintenance tasks. An analysis of the surrounding soil showed that the remains had been buried within a few days of her disappearance. There were no signs that the body had been moved. Whoever had put her there had done so swiftly, with purpose, and with an understanding of which areas would remain untouched by development for years. It was a carefully chosen hiding spot, near enough to the city to be convenient but isolated enough to ensure the body would not be found for a long time. Inside the plastic wrapping, the forensic team discovered more than just bones. They found fibers stuck to the plastic and clinging to the pieces of her clothing. Laboratory analysis confirmed that these fibers were consistent with the material of a heavy-duty cleaning tarp, the kind once used by the maintenance staff in her building. This tarp created a direct link between the burial site, the place she was last seen alive, and the man whose storage unit had already revealed disturbing evidence of his access and surveillance. For the detectives, the connection was undeniable. The palm print on her window, the late-night work logs, the key cards, and now the tarp all pointed to the same conclusion. She had been attacked in her apartment, and her body was then removed under the pretense of maintenance work and hidden near the river in an effort to completely erase her. The various pieces of the puzzle, which had been scattered for 10 years, had finally come together. The family was called in for another meeting, but this one felt different. For years, they had been told that investigators were making progress, but no words had ever conveyed the sense of finality they felt now. Their daughter's remains had been discovered. There was no more room for hope that she might return, no possibility of a miracle. Instead, they were left with the grim comfort of having answers, answers that explained her long silence but came at a price no family should ever have to pay. Her mother's reaction was one of raw emotion, a combination of devastation and vindication. For years, she had written letters insisting that her daughter had been taken and that something violent had occurred in that apartment. With the confirmation of the remains, her instincts were proven correct. But this validation felt empty. The man responsible was already dead, beyond the reach of the legal system. Justice would never be served in a courtroom. The family would be able to bury their daughter, but they would never have the chance to see the person responsible held accountable. The news of the discovery reignited public interest in the case. Headlines announced that the Chicago River mystery had been solved, although the detectives themselves were hesitant to use that word. Solved implied closure and resolution. What they had was the truth, but it was a truth without consequence. Reporters detailed the chilling specifics of the tarp, the burial, and the timeline. Commentators revisited the failures that had allowed the maintenance worker to avoid scrutiny for so long, pointing out how close the evidence had been all along. For the city, this revelation brought an end to one of its most unsettling urban legends. The woman who had vanished from a locked apartment was no longer a ghost story. She was a victim of a violent crime, hidden by someone who knew how to exploit the city's blind spots. The building where she had lived would forever be marked by her story, as would the riverfront where her body was discovered. For her family, the discovery signaled the end of their long wait but not the end of their grief. They had her back, but only to lay her to rest. They knew what had happened, but they would never know why. The silence that had persisted for 10 years had been shattered, but it was replaced by a deeper, more profound silence, the kind that remains when the person responsible is gone and the answers come too late for justice. After a decade of silence, the case finally had its answer. With the discovery of her remains by the Chicago River and the fibers that traced directly back to the building's maintenance supplies, investigators were able to reconstruct what had happened the night she vanished. It was not a voluntary disappearance, nor an unexplained ghost story. It was an attack carried out inside her own apartment, hidden in plain sight and covered up with chilling precision. Detectives determined that sometime after midnight, she was likely confronted in her apartment by the maintenance worker. He had access to her door, knowledge of her schedule, and the authority to be there without raising alarm. The faint streaks on the carpet, once dismissed as inconclusive, now told a clearer story. They believed she had been subdued, perhaps fatally injured, and then removed from the apartment. The service corridors that wove behind the main hallways provided the perfect escape route, allowing him to move unseen by cameras or neighbors. From there, her body was transported, wrapped in industrial plastic, and buried at the riverfront development site that he must have known was undisturbed at the time. The evidence was as close to a complete picture as detectives would ever have. The palm print on her window, the bleach traces in her bathroom, the fibers on her remains, and the key cards in his possession all were threads that tied back to the same man, the maintenance worker who had walked those halls at night, who had resigned abruptly after her disappearance, and who had lived the rest of his life in another state under another name. The case was presented to prosecutors, who agreed the evidence was strong enough to bring charges. A grand jury indicted him posthumously on charges of murder and unlawful concealment of a body. But the indictment was symbolic. He had died of an illness years earlier, taking with him the possibility of cross-examination, confession, or even denial. There would be no trial, no verdict read aloud in a courtroom, and no moment of justice for the family who had waited 10 years. When detectives delivered the news, the family sat in silence. Relief and devastation collided in the same breath. They finally knew what had happened, that their daughter had not left by choice, that her absence had always been the result of someone else's hand. But the knowledge came with no accountability. The man who had destroyed their lives was beyond reach, buried quietly without ever facing the truth of what he had done. Her mother wept as she clutched the folder of documents, pages filled with evidence that proved her daughter's fate. She told reporters later that the hardest part was not knowing why. Why her? Why that night? Why in a building where she should have been safest? Those questions would never be answered. The only thing left was the certainty of her death and the grim duty of burying her remains. The funeral took place on a gray afternoon, with family, friends, and strangers who had followed the case for years gathering together. They laid her to rest at last, placing flowers and photographs at her gravesite. For many, it was closure in the technical sense. Her body was returned, her story told, but closure was not what it felt like. What lingered instead was a hollow silence, a sense of justice denied, of truth delivered far too late. The city reflected on the case with unease. How had a man with complaints on his record and with access to master keys been overlooked for so long? How had the warnings, the odd behavior, and the inconsistencies in his alibi not raised alarms back in 2015? The answers were difficult to face. Oversight delay and a system stretched too thin had allowed him to operate undetected, and a family had paid the price. For the building itself, the shadow never lifted. 10 years after she disappeared, tenants still whispered in its hallways about the woman who had gone in and never come out, about the service corridors that hid more than anyone realized. Even with the truth revealed, The place carried an echo of what it had concealed. In the end, the case closed with truth but no justice. The family could bury their daughter, but they could not bury the torment of knowing her killer had escaped the one thing they had begged for all along: accountability. The silence that had stretched over 10 years had finally broken, but what replaced it was no less haunting. The echo of what the apartment hid remained, a reminder that some answers arrive only when it's too late to matter.